The letter was not long. 3 paragraphs, a closing, and a signature she had read 3 times without quite believing it. Sincere. Henrietta Schmidt set it on the table, rose, and crossed to the window overlooking Garfield Street. She stood with her hands folded at her waist, while Lady Cecily Ashford waited on the other side of the room with the particular patience of a woman who had not come to be refused a 3rd time. Outside, a cart horse leaned into a corner turn. A flower seller called her wares twice and received no answer. The ordinary London morning continued in every direction, entirely indifferent to what might or might not be decided inside these 4 walls. Henrietta turned. She did not ask why a lord of 31 had written a private letter to an unmarried woman with no claim on his attention. She understood why. She understood also what it had cost him to write it 6 times and burn the first 5, which Lady Cecily had mentioned upon arriving, offering it without inflection, simply a plain fact placed in the room for a person capable of using it correctly. The letter was not sufficient. She had read it 3 times all the same. Something in the 3rd reading had shifted, the way a pane of ice shifts before it decides what it will do. "I will need until Wednesday," she said. Lady Cecily's face made a small movement she could not quite prevent. Henrietta recognized it as relief. Wednesday was tomorrow. They both understood this without discussion. The story of why James Ashford, Earl of Whitmore, came to write 6 drafts of an apology to a woman he had spoken to precisely once began the previous February at the Glenmore Music Hall on Portman Square. Henrietta had come with Mrs. Cartwright, her father's oldest friend, who had known the Schmidt household in the years when Dr. Johann Schmidt's Kensington practice was comfortable, and the family name moved at the decent edge of professional London. That had been before the autumn, before the reading of the will in a solicitor's cramped office had yielded not a settled estate, but the neat arithmetic of creditors. £2,400 outstanding, and a daughter to whom the law extended no liability and no inheritance in equal measure. The house had been let. The practice dissolved. What remained to Henrietta Schmidt was a modest lodging on Garfield Street, the season's continued operations, and the daily task of maintaining her dignity in rooms that had already arrived at their verdict before she sat down in them. She wore gray silk that evening, her mother's, let out at the waist and retrimmed with ribbon she had reset herself. It was competent work. It was unmistakably repair. Lord Whitmore stood near the door during the 2nd piece. His profile, at that angle, was the particular still of a man who is present in a room and thinking somewhere else entirely. Henrietta noticed him the way one notices such men, with the clear awareness of structural distance, which requires no further calculation and invites none. She was not near him when she heard the first remark. She had been moving toward the tea table, half a step behind Mrs. Cartwright, when Lady Dorothea Graves said to her companion in the low, carrying voice of a woman long accustomed to being heard as far as she required, "The German physician's daughter. Quite the charity object, I'm afraid. The season will not have her. One feels the appropriate pity, naturally." She poured her tea without spilling it. She took a biscuit she would not eat. She returned to her chair and listened to the remainder of the 3rd piece, with her hands folded in her lap and her breathing even. Underneath the music, approximately 8 minutes later, she heard Lord Whitmore's voice at the periphery of the small group she occupied. He was speaking to a Treasury official about a matter of nothing particular when he said, with the bored precision of a man who has not considered whether anything present requires consideration, "Charming enough, I suppose. Rather too German for the season, don't you think?" She had not known he meant her until their gazes crossed briefly on the way out. His registered nothing. because she registered nothing in it either. She was not weeping when she reached Mrs. Cartwright's carriage. She was very cold. If you have ever been made invisible by a room that had decided your worth before you sat down in it, you know what Henrietta carried home from Portman Square that evening. Leave a word below. She earned the witnessing. Lady Cecily's first invitation arrived in March, handwritten and warm. Tea on Thursday, Curzon Street. A few friends she felt sure Miss Schmidt would enjoy. It was the kind of note one writes when one genuinely expects a welcome. Henrietta replied with genuine regret and a prior engagement that did not exist. She was not being ungenerous toward Lady Cecily, whose warmth was real and whose tea would have been exactly as pleasant as promised. The point was that she had spent 3 months in the quiet daily labor of not permitting the season's vocabulary to become her own. She was not inclined to step back into the room where she had last been weighed and found outside the Count. The second invitation came in April. It was somewhat longer, and it carried the careful quality of someone who had recognized the first refusal was not quite what it appeared, and who had chosen to proceed as though it were. Lady Cecily mentioned her brother only once, a single line about his being in the country on estate business and not expected for several weeks, as if to say, the difficulty you are imagining is not presently in residence. Henrietta sent a brief, firm note citing other engagements. She did not allow herself to read it again before she sealed the reply. Lady Cecily arrived the following Tuesday without a preliminary note, in a carriage bearing the Whitmore crest, carrying Lord Whitmore's sealed letter as matter-of-factly as though delivering private correspondence between an earl and an unmarried woman of no great social standing were an ordinary Tuesday errand. It was not ordinary. They were both aware of this. Henrietta admitted her because it would have been unkind not to, and because she was curious, and because she was 24 years old and had been being entirely sensible for 7 months, and was prepared, provisionally, to hear what a man wrote when he burned the first 5 attempts. The letter was not what she had anticipated. He had not offered context designed to diminish the weight of what he had said. He had named the remark directly, without softening, as precisely as it had been made. He had written, in handwriting slightly more deliberate than the paragraphs before it, that he had heard himself say it, and had not known how to unmake the saying in the moment of its saying. That he had spent the subsequent months understanding this to be a failure of character, not of circumstance. That he did not expect her to find it sufficient. He had been correct. It was not sufficient. It was, however, the most honest account of a wrong she had received from anyone in 3 months, of people declining to account for anything at all. He wrote it 6 times, Lady Cecily said from across the room. Burned the first 5. Henrietta folded the letter along its crease. He does not apologize easily, Cecily said, and there was no persuasion in it. Simply information, offered to a person capable of using it. No, Henrietta said. I can see that. She wrote her acceptance the following morning. The post-chaise covered the 40 miles to Whitmore Park in 4.5 hours along roads beginning to dry after a wet spring. Henrietta watched the city give way to village, and then to open country, and then to limestone gateposts she had not seen before, which were larger than she had imagined and older than she had accounted for. She had brought 3 dresses and her mother's copy of Cowper's poems, small enough to be carried easily. She had brought the fixed, quiet certainty that she could manage whatever was required of her for a fortnight's visit and depart without having embarrassed herself or anyone else. It had become, without her entirely intending it, the highest standard she applied to herself in any unfamiliar room. She had not yet decided whether it was a reasonable standard or a very small one. The entrance hall of Whitmore Park was tall and cool, with a stone floor that held the morning chill and a double staircase that split and curved symmetrically upward. Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, was kind in the way of women who have managed large households through enough upheaval to have made their kindness functional rather than easy. Lord Whitmore stood at the far end of the hall. She had prepared a small, composed speech of thanks. She did not deliver it. He said, after a moment that lasted rather longer than a moment, "Miss Schmidt, you are welcome here." The words were correct. His tone was level. He extended precisely what her arrival had earned, and nothing further. And she understood this perfectly, as she understood every economy of expression in a person who speaks less than they feel. She would not read warmth into level. She would not make that error twice. "Thank you, my lord," she said, and walked toward the staircase Mrs. Fenwick indicated, and did not look back. She learned later, from something Mrs. Fenwick let fall, without appearing to mean anything by it, that he had remained standing at the hall's end for some time after she disappeared from view. She filed it in the category of things that did not yet have a name. She found Thomas the following morning in the passage outside the nursery, before breakfast, before the house had arranged itself into its daily order. He was 3 years old and slight for his age, with his father's gray eyes and a cough that had been a feature of his winters since a birth that had not gone easily. He sat on the floor in his nightgown, the wooden horse in both hands, not playing with it, simply holding it, in the particular way of small children who have woken early and found the world unprepared for them. Henrietta stopped. He looked at her with the complete, unguarded candor of a child who has not yet learned to moderate what he extends to adults. "The horse has no name," he said. "That seems like a problem we could solve," she said. She sat on the floor beside him, which was not what a guest of any standing did in a house of this kind. He climbed against her side without ceremony, with the unself-conscious certainty of a child who has decided where he belongs and placed himself there. They named the horse Edmund, after deliberation that Thomas conducted with the seriousness the occasion required. Edmund was a good horse, mostly, but had a tendency to step in puddles. By the time the nursery maid appeared at the corridor's far end, flustered and apologetic, Thomas sat in the quiet particular to children who have been genuinely occupied, which is a different quiet entirely from children who have merely been managed. He watched her walk away toward the main stairs, with the focused attention of small children, for whom something has been provided they had not known to expect. She did not look back. The warmth required, for the moment, more privacy than the passage afforded. The dinner that evening gathered 12 at the long Whitmore Park table. Lord Whitmore at the head. Lady Cecily's laugh carried from the far end like a warmth rather than a sound. Lady Dorothea Graves sat at the first position to his right, the widow of a baronet and the most socially competent woman Henrietta had encountered since the season began, which was a form of capability she recognized without admiring. Lady Dorothea had made a single complete assessment of Henrietta upon her arrival in the dining room, the way a practiced reader moves through a document, and had moved on. She said nothing to Henrietta directly through the soup or the fish or the joint. She spoke instead to her neighbor, Mrs. Torrance, in the calibrated carrying voice of a woman who knows exactly how far she needs to be heard. "One admires Lady Cecily's instincts, naturally," she said pleasantly during the pause before the dessert. "Certain imports, however charming in their original setting, have a way of not quite settling where they are placed. The season has particular requirements. The house even more so." Mrs. Torrance nodded in that particular way that requires no opinion of one's own. Henrietta cut a portion of braised carrot and moved it to the side of her plate. She continued her conversation with the magistrate's wife about the county roads, which were apparently as bad as everyone had claimed, and possibly worse, and this provided sufficient material to carry through dessert without any requirement that she acknowledge the exchange to her left. She had learned early that the most effective response to a voice like that was to give it nothing to measure itself against. Lord Whitmore said nothing from the head of the table. He spoke with the gentleman at his left about drainage and with the gentleman at his right about the parish school. His face remained the face of a host performing his role with customary correctness, and he gave no indication that the exchange near Lady Dorothea had reached him at all. She was nearly back to her room before she noticed he had sent a footman to refill her glass twice during the meal. Quietly, without remark. It was such a small grace as to be nearly invisible. She noticed it all the same. She did not permit herself to decide what it meant. She woke before 4 on her third morning at Whitmore Park and could not return to sleep. The quiet of the country was the kind that amplifies rather than stills what one is not yet prepared to think about. She dressed, took the cowper from her trunk, and went downstairs. The library fire had already been laid and lit, the work of whoever begins the house before the house begins. She settled into the wing chair nearest the hearth, with the volume open on her knee, and had read perhaps 4 pages when she heard the small sound at the door. Thomas stood in the doorway in his nightgown. Edmund the wooden horse in both hands. "I cannot sleep," he said, with the authority of someone who has assessed the situation and determined it requires outside assistance. She made room in the wing chair. He climbed in beside her without hesitation, with the unself-conscious occupation of a child who has already decided the space is his. She chose the short pastoral verses from the cowper, the ones with a rolling cadence suited to listening, and she read to him quietly while the fire settled, and the room held its dark, and Thomas's breathing gradually slowed and evened. He was asleep within 20 minutes. She kept reading, because the warmth of a sleeping child is its own argument against movement, and because the room was very still, and because there was no one present for whom she needed to be anything but what she was. A woman in a library at 4 in the morning, reading aloud to no one at all, in a house that had not yet decided what to do with her. She did not hear Lord Whitmore come to the doorway. She had no sense of him there at all. She was 6 lines into the 14th verse when Thomas shifted in his sleep, and she adjusted her arm to hold him steadier. And she read on, and the fire settled once, and she read on. She was not performing anything. There was no audience present, and therefore nothing to perform. He stood there for a long time. She did not know how long. She did not know he was there at all. She turned a page. Thomas murmured something. Not words, only the small sounds of sleeping warmth. She turned another page. The candle had shortened by 1 careful degree. When she finally rose, gently, to settle Thomas against the chair cushions and tuck the blanket around him, she crossed the room toward the door and found the doorway empty. The corridor beyond was dark and still. She stepped out with the cowper under her arm and made her way back toward the main stairs. He had been there. She did not know it. The morning after was clear, with a quality of spring light that arrives in England without announcement and stays only as long as the clouds permit. Lord Whitmore was in the East Garden when she came out with her shawl, cutting back the season's first overgrowth with a methodical attention that suggested he had been there for some time. She had intended to walk the path toward the kitchen garden, which Mrs. Fenwick had mentioned as worth seeing. The path crossed the East Garden at its western edge. He looked up when she came around the hedge. For a moment neither of them spoke, and the air between them had the particular quality that proximity carries in the open air, without walls to organize it into something manageable. "The roses were my mother's project," he said, without preamble. "I have not allowed them to be neglected." She walked closer, because the path required it. He held the shears at his side and watched her consider the nearest cane, cut at the careful angle of someone who knows what the plant requires. "She must have loved this garden very much," Henrietta said. "She did." He said it simply, without elaboration. His eyes moved from the roses to her face, a half-second before his expression could arrange itself into something less direct. She looked at the roses. The morning light was warm on the side of her face, and she was aware of it with a clarity she had not asked for. She found him again the following afternoon, when she returned the cowper to its place on the middle library shelf. She was reaching upward when she heard him come in behind her. And then his hand came to the shelf edge 2 inches from hers, steadying a volume that had been leaning against nothing in particular, which was a task requiring no steadying at all. She stepped back. He did not step forward. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "For Thomas." She kept her eyes on the shelves. "He has very strong opinions about horse names." Something shifted in the corner of her vision. Not quite a smile. She turned. He had already looked toward the window. His jaw had the quality she had observed since her arrival, the quality of a man who has worn self-command long enough that it has become structural, and with it the particular exhaustion of keeping a thing in place for years. "You are very good with him," he said, and she heard the weight under it, which was not merely a compliment. It was the weight of a man who has watched someone offer his child something he could not provide himself, and who had no adequate language for what this produced in him. She learned the shape of his grief that evening, not from him, but from Mrs. Fenwick, who shared it in the way of housekeepers who have managed a household through its worst years, and who sometimes cannot stop themselves. Thomas's mother had died 11 months after his birth. The birth itself had been long and dangerous, and the illness that followed had been the kind that takes its time. There was a pianoforte in the small sitting room off the corridor, kept exactly as it had last been played, the bench not quite pushed in, the music open on the stand to the 3rd page of a Clementi sonata. She had seen it through the open door on her second day, and had not entered. Lord Whitmore mentioned his late wife once, the following afternoon, in the corridor outside that closed door. He was passing through, and stopped. "She played in the evenings," he said. He did not look at the door. He did not look away from it. He held both positions at once, which was a form of endurance she recognized. "I have not had the bench moved." He continued down the corridor without waiting for her response. She stood in the passage for a moment, the sitting room door on her left, the sounds of the ordinary house around her. Somewhere above, Thomas was being put down for his afternoon rest. She had asked nothing, and he had told her anyway. She understood this to be its own kind of crossing. The cards that evening were a small gathering, 6 of them in the yellow drawing room, and Lady Dorothea arranged herself near the fire with the practiced efficiency of a woman who controls the angles of a room before anyone else has sat down. They played whist. Lady Dorothea won 2 hands. During the reshuffle, she let her gaze move pleasantly around the table. "How agreeable," she said to the table generally, "to have such company in a house that has been rather quiet these past years. One does hope Lord Whitmore finds it restorative." Her eyes settled briefly on Henrietta. "Though of course not every comfort is a settled fit. One must consider what the house requires in the long term." Mr. Haverford laughed because the moment seemed to require it. Lord Whitmore set his cards face down. It was not a violent motion. It was a motion with a weight behind it that stilled the table for the breadth of a single breath. "I believe it is Miss Schmidt's lead," he said. He said nothing further. Lady Dorothea opened her fan. The round continued. It was at the full dinner, 2 evenings later, all 12 assembled, that Lady Dorothea chose her moment. The conversation had moved from the Church Restoration Fund to the season's prospects, and then, with the particular ease of someone who has been navigating toward a destination through 3 courses, Lady Dorothea set her wine-glass precisely on the cloth and turned toward Lord Whitmore with the graciousness of a woman making a generous observation. "One does hope," she said, "that the Schmidt connection has been a productive one. So kind of Lady Cecily to have arranged it. A guest in reduced circumstances benefits from a change of setting, naturally." She paused. "I understand the physician's debts were not quite negligible. £2,400, one hears, which is a considerable sum. One trusts it is not what brought her to Whitmore Park." The table held the quiet of 12 people processing something simultaneously. Henrietta set her fork down very carefully. The braised vegetables before her were cooling at a regular rate. The candlelight was steady. "A daughter," Lady Cecily said from the table's far end, with a precision entirely unlike her usual warmth, "cannot legally inherit her father's debts, which I believe you know, Lady Dorothea." "Naturally." The smile did not waver. "One speaks only of circumstance, of the overall picture, a young woman of limited prospects making herself useful where she may." She addressed the table, not Henrietta. "It is a very German arrangement, one finds. Practical. Admirable, in its way. The same word. 3rd time, lifted into respectable syntax and placed before 12 witnesses." Lord Whitmore was very still at the table's head. Henrietta did not look at him. She looked at the dark window to her left, and then at her plate. She was cold, in the way she had been in Mrs. Cartwright's carriage, when the words had reached her, and there was nothing to do except go on. She excused herself after the dessert, citing a headache. It was not precisely true. It was not precisely false. By midnight she had made her decision. She packed the 3 dresses, the cowper, and the small folded letter in its worn crease. She would have Mrs. Fenwick arrange a conveyance in the morning. She drafted her note to Lord Whitmore 3 times before arriving at a single sentence, that she was grateful for the hospitality of Whitmore Park and wished the household well. She sealed it, set it on the writing table, and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, performing the very calm, deliberate accounting one performs when one has decided not to permit the injury its full dimension until one is somewhere one can afford it. Lord Whitmore was in the passage when she came out in the early morning, the small portmanteau already in her hand. He had clearly not slept. He stood 3 feet from her door with the stillness of a man who has placed himself somewhere and intends to remain. "You are leaving," he said. "Yes." She kept her voice level. "I think it is the correct decision. Lady Dorothea's remarks do not represent this house. I know that. She did, entirely. I am not leaving because of Lady Dorothea." She paused. "I am leaving because the question of what I am here has become more complicated than a guest's position can accommodate. It is better to simplify matters." He said nothing. His face had the quality of a man who has heard something stated correctly and finds it difficult to argue against. She moved to step past him. "I am glad I came," she said, stopping beside him without turning. "I want you to know that. Whatever was said at dinner, whatever the season's accounting of it, I am glad for Thomas and for Lady Cecily, and for the library and the roses." She made herself finish it. "I am glad for this house." She had taken 2 steps toward the staircase when he said her name. Not Miss Schmidt. Her name. "Henrietta." She turned. "I did not write 6 drafts of an apology because Lady Cecily asked it of me," he said. She suggested it once, and I refused, and then thought about it for 2 months, and wrote it myself. I want you to know this is not obligation. I want you to know that when I stood in the library doorway and watched you with Thomas, what I felt was not gratitude. He held her gaze without offering her any help in receiving it. I am asking you, specifically, not the season's candidate, not a physician's daughter. You. She stood very still. He had said her name. He had said you. She had been the thing the season could not see for 7 months. She had carried it without complaint, and managed it, and maintained her floor. And now a man was standing in a passage in the early light of a May morning, not measuring her gown or her gloves or her father's debts, and it was going to require considerably more than she had prepared herself to feel. You said I was too German for the season, she said. Yes. He did not look away. I was wrong. I am standing in my own passage asking you to remain, without condition. And I'm aware that I have no right to expect you to find it sufficient. She looked at him for a long time, in the way one looks at a thing when the looking is already the answer. I find you, she said carefully, rather more sufficient than I anticipated. She carried the portmanteau back to her room. That afternoon, the company was assembled in the yellow drawing room after the midday meal. Lady Dorothea held her position near the window with the practiced ease of a woman who has received no indication that the field has shifted. The previous evening had resolved itself, in her accounting, as a natural return to order. The doctor's daughter would be quietly sensible. The situation would settle. Lord Whitmore came into the room from the library passage and crossed it in 3 strides, and stood in the middle of it in such a way that 11 people oriented toward him without being asked to. I have an announcement for those still in residence through Thursday, he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform anything. He stood where he was and spoke with the authority of a man who understands exactly what his words cost and has decided this expenditure is correct. At the Musicale at Portman Square in February, he said, I made a remark about Miss Schmidt that was both inaccurate and unkind. I made it in front of people who had no cause to disbelieve me, and I have thought of it with considerable regret since. I want to correct it now, before people who have equally no cause to disbelieve me. Near the window, Lady Dorothea's fan remained where it was. Something moved across her face, the precise movement of a calculation encountering a figure it had not accounted for. Miss Henrietta Schmidt, he said, and his eyes found her at the room's edge, where she had stopped when he came through the door, is a woman of uncommon worth. I have been fortunate enough to see it at some length over the past 2 weeks. I intend, with her consent, to give this acquaintance a rather more permanent form. He looked at her, only at her. She held his gaze. She said, in front of 11 people, the daughter of a German physician in a gown retrimmed by her own hand, with 2,400 pounds of debt behind her and the season's verdict arranged against her. You have it. The room was quiet for the width of 1 breath before it understood what had been said. Lady Cecily made a sound not quite contained by the room's general composure. The young clergyman near the hearth straightened. Mr. Haverford looked from Lord Whitmore to Henrietta, and appeared, for the first time in the acquaintance, to be genuinely present in what was occurring. Lady Dorothea's fan remained still. Something crossed her face. The recognition of a woman who has spent 40 years maintaining an order she did not invent and could not dismantle, encountering the specific moment in which that order has been corrected in front of 11 witnesses by the one man whose opinion organized her confidence. Her chin did not drop. She was, Henrietta thought, with a charity she could afford now, a person whose world had simply proved smaller than she had believed it. The calculation had been sincere. The figure had been wrong. Henrietta gave her a slight, genuine nod. Lady Dorothea blinked. She inclined her head, just fractionally, and looked away toward the window. It was a kind of recognition, and it was enough. Mr. Paulson arrived from Shropshire the following morning, a small, precise man in a brown coat who spoke in organized sentences and produced the relevant documents with the efficiency of someone who had been contacted before the drawing-room announcement and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. He confirmed in the yellow drawing-room, with Lady Cecily and the county magistrate as witnesses, that the settlements were appropriate and the engagement properly recorded. He shook Lord Whitmore's hand, bowed to Henrietta, and departed before tea. Lady Dorothea left Whitmore Park that same afternoon, citing a prior commitment recalled with gracious regret. She did not return. There was nothing unkind in her departure. There was only the acceptance of a woman who had arrived to protect a particular order and found the order had reorganized itself around a different center, and who possessed sufficient dignity to withdraw without theater. Lady Cecily, by contrast, embraced Henrietta in the entrance hall with an energy entirely inconsistent with the composed certainty she had worn across the preceding month, which was how Henrietta understood that the certainty had required, in some measure, considerable effort to maintain. "I knew," Cecily said against her shoulder, "from the second letter. You burned the first 5 with him?" "I watched him burn them," Cecily said, pulling back, unashamed. "He let me read the 6th. Henrietta looked at her. "It was very good," Cecily said. "The 6th one." By the first Sunday of December, the snow had been lying across the park for 4 days, the particular settled snow of a season that has committed itself, rather than the theatrical first dusting of November. The lime trees at the park's edge stood in it without any appearance of surprise. The library fire was the largest in the house. Thomas had been brought down after his rest, which had required fewer blankets than any previous winter. So markedly fewer that Mrs. Fenwick had remarked on it twice, and the nursery maid once, with the particular approval of women who have watched a small child struggle through cold seasons and who find improvement nearly as moving as the original worry. He was walking now, with the deliberate concentration of a child who has recently discovered that walking is possible and intends to conduct the project at his own pace. He crossed the library toward the fireplace, Edmund the wooden horse in one hand, his free hand steadying along the edge of the low bookshelves, pausing twice to look back over his shoulder at Henrietta, with the expression of a person checking that the audience has witnessed the proceeding. "Very good," she said each time. He reached the hearthrug and sat down with the satisfaction of a rival, pulled Edmund into his lap, and began a quiet conversation with the horse about the fire, which appeared to require both of Edmund's carved ears. Lord Whitmore appeared at the library door in the afternoon's last blue light, having come in from the estate, and stood in the doorway and watched his son cross the hearthrug with the small, deliberate steps of a child who had spent too many months confined, and who was, now, most decidedly not. His face was the face she had once seen only from across a room she had believed empty. She looked at him from her place near the window. He looked at her. The domestic quiet of the room held them both. The household book sat on the table to her left, its pages filled with her careful tallies. The linen inventory, the kitchen accounts, the provisions ordered and received. She had begun keeping it in September, the week after the wedding, because her mother had taught her, and because the house required it, and because it was, in all the ways that mattered, her house now. Pressed into the back pages, between the last column and the book's end cover, was the letter. She had placed it there the week after Mr. Paulson's visit, smoothing it along its worn crease one final time before tucking it into the book's back. Not as a record. Not as a relic. simply as a thing that had occurred and mattered and deserved to be kept somewhere solid. She had read it 3 times in February and had not needed to read it again. Outside, the snow fell in slow lines past the library window. Thomas was telling Edmund something important about the fire, using the particular serious intonation of a 3-year-old who expects the horse to find this relevant. Lord Whitmore crossed the library toward her with the unhurried certainty of a man who knows what he is moving toward, and there was no need to say anything, and they did not. The piano in the small sitting room had been played for the first time that November. Not the Clementi Sonata. Something simpler. Something she had found on the second shelf, marked lightly in pencil by a hand she had learned was not quite hers to fill. She had played 4 pages and then stopped. Not because it was wrong, but because it was enough for one evening. She would play it again in the spring.